Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a highly specific and honestly an intensely focused evangelical framework. Our source material for this explainer lays out a truly distinct theological worldview. It's one that frames human history, modern media, and even institutional religion straight through the lens of a massive cosmic battle. Now, whether you're studying modern media, sociology, or religion, getting a look at how these massive broadcasting empires construct their worldviews is absolutely fascinating. We are going to objectively map out exactly how the author constructs this argument, breaking down their claims from these grand cosmic premises all the way down to practical, everyday theology. I love getting into the structural nuts and bolts of these texts, so get ready to see exactly how this perspective is built, piece by piece. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our agenda for today. First, we've got the light in the darkness. Second, the mandate to broadcast. Third, true and false churches. Fourth, the eras of the church. And finally, number 5, the ultimate answer.
Starting right off with Section 1, the light in the darkness, or the cosmic conflict.
Right out of the gate, this text doesn't just hand us a mild religious idea. No, it frames the entire world as a dramatic, totally active spiritual battlefield. Everything, and I mean everything, is categorized into an absolute binary of light versus darkness. Look at how the author uses this specific verse from John, chapter 1. The text asserts that the light mentioned here strictly and exclusively represents Jesus Christ and the Incarnation. The author leaves literally zero room for ambiguity. They explicitly list figures like Buddha, Karl Marx, and Muhammad, stating flatly that all others are false. According to this specific framework, there is absolutely no other source of spiritual light in the universe. If this particular light isn't present, the text claims, only pure darkness remains.
To really deepen this battlefield imagery, the author actually digs into the original Greek. They focus on the word comprehended from that verse we just looked at, identifying it as Katalambano. The text defines this as to seize upon, to keep down or under, to stop. So the author uses this precise definition to argue that Satan, who they view as the literal embodiment of darkness, did absolutely everything within his power to seize upon and stop this light from shining. But the text argues he completely failed. This failure, according to the source, was totally finalized at the cross, where all opposing spiritual powers were permanently spoiled.
Moving on to Section 2, the mandate to broadcast, taking the message global. Having established this intense cosmic conflict, the text makes a hard pivot straight into urgent real-world application. The author actually justifies their massive investment in modern media in 2 distinct steps. Step 1 is universal. The text claims it's the inherent responsibility of every single believer to carry this light to a sin-cursed world. But step 2? Well, that's highly personal. The author states they've received a special, unavoidable divine call specifically to television and radio. They literally write that they have no alternative or choice in this matter. They plead for funds to air their programming globally because, in their view, it's a direct mandate from the divine.
And you know what? The text claims this media strategy has been incredibly effective. The author states that hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions, have been reached through their broadcasts. It creates this fascinating catch-22. They believe this massive broadcasting success is the exact reason why they face such intense opposition. They argue that Satan fights so hard to get their telecast off the air precisely because the light is effectively driving out the darkness.
Which brings us to Section 3, True and False Churches, the Institutional Failure.
Now, this is where things get really polarizing. The author draws a harsh, unyielding dichotomy right through the middle of modern Christianity. On one side, you have what the text calls God's church, which is defined simply as those who proclaim this specific gospel. Crucially, though, the author notes this group is very few in number. On the other side is what the author provocatively labels Satan's church. The insidious nature of this false church, according to the text, is that it looks very similar to the real thing. It mimics true religion, but its actual purpose is to stop the gospel.
To underscore this point, the author makes a truly striking claim. They write that the modern church is in a worse spiritual condition today than it has been at any time since the Reformation. Think about that for a second. This isn't just a mild critique. It's a sweeping indictment of modern institutional religion as a whole. And to explain how things supposedly got this bad, the author takes us on a historical journey.
Let's move to Section 4 and see how this builds. The eras of the church, a theological timeline.
The author uses a very specific interpretation of history to prove their point about spiritual decline and recovery. The text outlines this clear chronological sub-arc. It starts way back in 33 AD with the early church, which the author claims held the true message of the cross given to the Apostle Paul. But then comes a massive decline. The text points to the 600s and the rise of the Catholic Church, claiming this era actively hid the Bible, the light, bringing about the Dark Ages. Then the recovery phase begins. The 1600s Reformation brings back justification by faith, which is the idea of being made right with God. The 1800s holiness message recovers sanctification, the process of living a holy life. The 1900s Pentecostal message brings back the Holy Spirit. And finally, the present day brings us full circle, right back to the message of the cross.
But here's the kicker. Even recent history isn't safe from the author's critique. The text asserts that modern Pentecostal denominations have severely backslidden. The author claims that many have totally stopped preaching the baptism of the Holy Spirit and are even denying original tenets, like speaking in tongues as an initial physical evidence. Because they've turned their backs on the Word, the author makes the drastic claim that these groups too have become part of Satan's church by effectively stopping the true gospel.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core tension of the author's entire worldview. If almost all institutional religion, even the recently recovered Pentecostal movement, has failed and morphed into an opposing force, what on earth is the cure? How does this framework propose actually defeating the darkness in the modern day?
That leads us to our final part, Section 5, the ultimate answer, the message of the cross.
This is where the text brings everything together to present its definitive spiritual cure to those massive historical and cosmic problems it just outlined. The author shifts from theological history right down to boots-on-the-ground human suffering. They claim to have witnessed tens of thousands of people delivered from severe bondages. The text specifically lists things like acute alcoholism and late-stage drug addiction as physical chains that are literally broken by this message. But pay close attention to that last point. The author explicitly states that the terrible bondage of religion is in many cases far worse than chemical addictions. The framework views human-made religious effort as a total trap.
So the author concludes with absolute, uncompromising exclusivity. Because human religious efforts are seen as a terrible bondage and institutional churches are seen as completely compromised, the text insists that only Jesus Christ and his work at the cross can provide deliverance. The author writes that it is the answer, the solution, and factually, the only answer. Nothing else, no amount of human effort, no traditional church structure is capable of shining the light.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating paradox to chew on. If an entire theological framework is built on the premise that traditional institutional religious structures are actually dangerous bondages that just mimic the truth, how do followers of this message actually build community? What does a shared life of faith look like when the very building you gather in is viewed with such intense suspicion? It's a profound question about the nature of belief, belonging, and structure that this text really forces us to ask. Thank you so much for joining me to map all this out. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.